Noah Bennett had always been a man of control. At 34, he'd climbed the ranks of Westwood Financial in Seattle to become its youngest CEO, a title he wore like armor, but today that armor was cracking. The boardroom had been a battlefield, voices sharp and accusing, pinning the blame on him for a $10 million investment that had gone south. He'd fought back, his words cold and precise, but inside, he was unraveled. He needed air, space, anything to escape the weight pressing down on him. His polished shoes echoed through the sleek halls of the Westwood Tower as he moved, barely aware of where he was going. Then it happened. Distracted, his mind a storm of numbers and guilt, he turned a corner and pushed open a door he thought led to a quiet lounge. Instead, he stepped into the women's bathroom on the executive floor, a space reserved for VIP guests. The air hit him first, warm and steamy, carrying the faint scent of lavender, and then his eyes caught her. Lila Hayes was there, submerged in a hot tub nestled against the tiled wall, her skin glistening under a thin layer of bubbles. Water lapped gently around her, splashing as she shifted, unaware of him. She was singing, her voice soft and haunting, a melody that trembled with sadness. Her eyes were closed, lashes wet, maybe from the steam, maybe from tears. Noah froze, his breath catching in his throat. He'd seen beauty before, but this was different, raw and unguarded, like stumbling into a secret he wasn't meant to know. His mind screamed at him to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. Then he coughed, a small, involuntary sound, and her eyes snapped open. They were wide, hazel and piercing, locking onto him with a mix of shock and fury. Water splashed as she jolted upright, bubbles sliding down her arms. "Who are you? Get out!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the steam. Noah stumbled back, heat rushing to his face. "I didn't mean to," he stammered, turning away, but her image burned into him, those eyes, that voice. "I'm sorry," he managed, his hand fumbling for the door. He stepped out, slamming it shut, heart pounding like he'd run a marathon. Leaning against the wall, he closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. "I've seen 1,000 faces," he thought, "but none like hers. She looked broken, yet untouchable, like a storm I couldn't escape." He should have left it there, walked away, forgotten it. But fate had other plans. The door swung open again, and there she was, wrapped in a towel, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders. She marched toward him, barefoot on the marble floor, her presence commanding despite her vulnerability. "Do you just barge into people's lives like this?" she demanded, her voice sharp but trembling. Noah straightened, forcing calm into his tone. "I didn't expect to find you, or anyone," he said, meeting her gaze. Up close, she was even more striking, her cheeks flushed, her lips parted in anger. There was something familiar about her, something he couldn't place. She crossed her arms, the towel slipping slightly, but she didn't flinch. "Well, you did," she snapped. "Next time, watch where you're going." She turned to leave, but as she did, a necklace slipped from her grip, hitting the floor with a soft clink. Noah bent to pick it up, his fingers brushing the cool metal. It was a simple chain with a pendant, a small W engraved on it, the same W that marked every Westwood Financial logo. "Wait," he called, holding it out. "This yours?" She froze, her hand darting out to snatch it back, but not before he saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. "Thanks," she muttered, clutching it tight, then disappeared back into the bathroom. Noah stood there, the necklace's shape lingering in his mind. "She's hiding something," he thought, his pulse still racing, "and I need to know what." He didn't understand why it mattered, why this stranger had shaken him so deeply. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away, not yet. The rest of that day blurred past, the meeting's fallout fading into noise. He sat in his office, staring out at the rain streaking the Seattle skyline, but all he saw was her. Those eyes, that voice, the way she'd stood up to him despite everything. "I've spent my life chasing control," he thought, "but she's the first thing I can't shake." Little did he know, that moment in the steam was just the beginning. Lila Hayes wasn't just a woman in a hot tub. She was a mystery, a wound, and maybe, just maybe, the one thing he'd never known he needed. Noah Bennett couldn't sleep that night. The rain tapped against his penthouse windows, a steady rhythm that matched the unrest in his chest. He replayed the scene over and over, the steam, the splash of water, Lila's voice slicing through the haze. He'd built his life on order, on knowing every move before he made it, but she'd thrown him off balance in a way he couldn't explain. I've spent years building walls around myself, he thought, staring at the ceiling. Why does she feel like the crack in them? The next morning, he arrived at Westwood Financial early, his suit crisp, his face a mask of calm. But inside, he was restless. He told himself it was just curiosity, that he'd forget her by noon. Then he saw her again. She was outside the building, standing under a dripping awning, her thin jacket soaked through. She was talking to the manager of the coffee shop across the street, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear. "I can work any shift, please, I just need a chance," she said, her tone steady but desperate. The manager shook his head. "We're full, try somewhere else." Noah watched her shoulders slump just for a second before she straightened them again. Something about her resilience tugged at him, a thread he didn't want to pull. But he was already moving, crossing the street before he could stop himself. "Hey!" he called, his voice cutting through the rain. She turned, and those hazel eyes met his again, narrowing with recognition. "You," she said, her tone wary. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets to hide the tension in them. "Work for me," he said, the words out before he could rethink them. 1 month. I need someone who doesn't flinch." She stared at him, rain dripping from her hair, her expression unreadable. "Why me?" she asked, her voice low. He didn't have a good answer, not one he could say aloud. "You've got fire," he said instead. "I could use that." Lila hesitated, her fingers brushing the necklace hidden under her jacket. Then she nodded, short and sharp. "Fine. But don't think this means I owe you." Her words were a wall, but Noah saw the crack in it, the way her eyes softened for a fleeting moment. "I don't," he replied, and they stood there, the rain falling between them like a promise neither understood yet. She started that day, stepping into his world with a quiet efficiency that surprised him. Lila Hayes was no ordinary assistant. She handled his chaotic schedule, fielded calls with a cool edge, and never missed a detail. But she kept her distance, her answers short, her past locked away. Noah found himself watching her more than he should, noticing the small things, the way she twisted that necklace when she was stressed, the way her lips curved slightly when she thought no one was looking. One evening, they were alone in his office, the city lights glowing beyond the glass. He was reviewing reports, she was organizing files, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Then she spoke, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "I thought I was invisible," she said, her eyes on the papers, until he looked at me like I was the only one in the room. She hadn't meant for him to hear, he realized. It was a thought that slipped out, raw and unguarded. Noah's pen paused over the page. He glanced at her, her profile sharp against the dim light, and something shifted inside him. Who was she talking about, he wondered, but he didn't ask. Instead, he pretended to keep working, his mind racing. "She's not invisible," he thought, "not to me. I don't know why that matters, but it does." Days turned into a week, and their routine settled into something unspoken. She challenged him in small ways, pushing back when he was too curt, finishing his sentences when he trailed off. He started to rely on her, not just for work, but for the way she filled the silence he'd grown used to. Once, as they reviewed a contract, he caught her humming that same sad tune from the bathroom. "You sing a lot," he said, keeping his tone casual. She stopped, her hand freezing mid-motion. "Habit," she muttered, not looking at him. "Helps me think." He nodded, but inside he was piecing her together, each fragment a question he couldn't yet ask. "There's a story in that song," he thought, "and I want to hear it, all of it." Lila Hayes was a puzzle, one he hadn't meant to solve, but every glance, every word, pulled him deeper. He didn't know it then, but she was already changing him, softening the edges he'd spent years sharpening. And she, somewhere in the quiet of her own heart, was starting to feel it too, the way his presence made her question the walls she'd built. Noah Bennett had never been one for feelings. He'd spent his life measuring success in numbers, in deals closed and profits gained. But lately, Lila Hayes was rewriting that equation. 2 weeks into her temporary role as his assistant at Westwood Financial, she'd become more than a shadow in his office. She was a presence, quiet but undeniable, and Noah found himself caught in her orbit. They worked late most nights, the Seattle skyline a backdrop of twinkling lights beyond his office windows. Lila moved with purpose, organizing files, answering emails, her efficiency a silent challenge to his own precision. But it wasn't her skill that kept him awake at night. It was the way she carried herself, strong yet fragile, like glass that could cut if you got too close. Every time she smiles, he thought, watching her sort papers across the room, it's like she's fighting a war I can't see. She didn't talk much about herself, deflecting his rare questions with a shrug or a quick change of subject, but Noah noticed things, the way her fingers lingered on that necklace with the W pendant, twisting it when she was lost in thought, the way her eyes darkened when he mentioned the company's past projects. He wanted to ask, to peel back her layers, but something held him back, a fear of breaking whatever fragile thread was tying them together. One night, that thread snapped. They were alone, the clock ticking past 11, the office silent except for the hum of the heater. Lila was stacking folders when one slipped, spilling its contents across the floor. She knelt to gather them, and a small photograph fluttered out, landing at Noah's feet. He picked it up, his breath catching as he saw it. A younger Lila, maybe 20, stood next to an older man in a Westwood Financial uniform, his arm around her, both smiling. "Who's this?" Noah asked, holding the photo out to her. Lila's head snapped up, her eyes widening for a split second before narrowing into something hard. She snatched it back, her fingers trembling. "Someone you wouldn't care about," she said, her voice sharp, almost a growl. She stuffed the photo into her bag and stood, turning away, but not before he saw the glint of tears. "Lila," he said, softer now, stepping closer. "I didn't mean to pry." She didn't respond, just kept her back to him, her shoulders rigid. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get it, do you? You sit up here running this place while people like him get forgotten." She grabbed her coat and walked out, leaving Noah staring after her, the photo's image burned into his mind. He couldn't let it go. The next day, he dug into the company archives, something he hadn't done in years. It took hours, but he found it, a report buried in a file marked closed incidents. James Hayes, a maintenance engineer, killed in a machinery accident 8 years ago. The details were sparse, a few lines about equipment failure, a settlement paid to his family. But Noah's stomach twisted as he read the fine print. A note from the safety team, ignored by management to cut costs. James had warned them, and they'd let him die. Noah leaned back in his chair, the report trembling in his hands. She's his daughter, he thought, the pieces clicking together. She blames us, blames me. He didn't know James hadn't been CEO then, but the guilt hit him anyway, a weight he couldn't shake. He thought of Lila's eyes, the pain behind them, and wondered what she'd come here to do. When she walked in later that morning, he watched her closely. She was quieter than usual, her movements mechanical, avoiding his gaze. He tried to focus on work, but his mind was elsewhere. She's not just here to survive, he thought. She's here for something more. He wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. That evening they were alone again, reviewing a contract. The tension between them was palpable, a storm brewing beneath the surface. Noah broke the silence, his voice low. "You think I don't see you," he said, looking at her across the desk. "But I do, more than you know." Lila's pen stopped, her hand tightening around it. She met his eyes, and for a moment he saw vulnerability there, raw and unguarded. "Then why does it scare me so much?" she replied, her voice cracking. He didn't have an answer, not one he could voice. Instead, he held her gaze, feeling the distance between them shrink, if only for a second. "She's afraid of me," he thought, "or maybe of what I'm starting to mean to her." He didn't know when it had happened, when she'd gone from a stranger in a hot tub to someone he couldn't imagine losing. Leila looked away first, her fingers brushing that necklace again. "I used to think I could outrun it," she said almost to herself. "The past, the pain. But it follows you, doesn't it?" Noah nodded, understanding more than she realized. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it does." They worked in silence after that, but it was different now, heavier, laced with something neither could name. Noah watched her, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way her lips pressed together when she was deep in thought. "I've been alone so long," he thought, "but with her, it's like I'm waking up." Lila felt it too, though she'd never admit it. Every time he spoke, every time his eyes lingered on her, it chipped away at the armor she'd built. "I came here to hate him," she thought, staring at the contract in her hands, "to destroy everything he stands for. So why does my heart ache when he's near?" She'd come to Westwood with a plan, to find proof of the cover-up, to make them pay. But Noah wasn't the monster she'd expected, and that terrified her most of all. Their connection was growing, fragile but real, a thread stretched tight between hate and something softer. Neither knew it yet, but the truth was coming, and it would test everything they were starting to feel. Noah Bennett couldn't keep pretending. The truth about James Hayes had been gnawing at him since he'd found that report, a shadow he couldn't outrun. 3 weeks into Lila Hayes' time at Westwood Financial, the air between them had thickened with unspoken words, a tension that felt like it could snap at any moment. He knew she was hiding something, and he knew he had to face it, no matter what it cost him. It was late, the office empty except for the two of them. Rain pounded against the windows, a relentless drumbeat that matched the storm in his chest. Leila was at her desk, typing, her face a mask of focus, but Noah saw the strain in her eyes, the way her fingers hesitated over the keys. He couldn't take it anymore. He stood, crossing the room, the report clutched in his hand like a weapon he didn't want to use. "Lila," he said, his voice steady but low, "we need to talk." She looked up, her hazel eyes narrowing, sensing the shift in him. "About what?" she asked, her tone guarded. He held up the report, watching her face as he spoke. "James Hayes, your father. I know what happened." The change was instant. Lila's mask shattered, her eyes widening, then hardening into something fierce. She stood, her chair scraping back, hands clenched at her sides. "You don't get to say his name," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "Your company killed him, covered it up like he was nothing, and you stand there like it's just another day at work." Noah flinched, her words cutting deeper than he'd expected. "I didn't know," he said, stepping closer, desperate for her to hear him. "I wasn't CEO then, Lila. I found the report, saw what they did. He warned them and they ignored him. I'm sorry." His voice broke on the last word, raw and unguarded, but she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Sorry doesn't bring him back," she said, her voice rising. "Sorry doesn't erase the years I spent wondering why I wasn't enough to keep him safe." She turned away, her shoulders shaking, but Noah couldn't let her go, not like this. He reached out, gently touching her arm. "I wasn't there then," he said, softer now. "But I'm here now, and I see you, Lila. I see you." She spun back, wrenching her arm free, her eyes blazing through the tears. "Don't," she snapped. "You don't get to see me. I thought I wasn't worth loving until you looked at me like I was your whole world, and I hate you for it." Her words hit him like a punch, stealing his breath. She grabbed the necklace from her neck, the one with the woo, and threw it at him. It clattered to the floor, a small, broken sound in the silence. Lila stormed out, her coat forgotten, leaving Noah standing there, the necklace at his feet. He bent to pick it up, his fingers closing around it, the metal warm from her skin. "I've lost deals, money, trust," he thought, his chest tight. "But losing her feels like losing myself." He sank into his chair, staring at the report, the rain blurring the world outside. He'd known she was hurting, but this was a wound he couldn't fix with words. The next day, he barely functioned. Meetings passed in a haze, his mind on her, on the anger and pain in her eyes. He went back to the archives, digging deeper, needing to understand. He found emails, memos, proof that the company had buried James' warnings to save a few dollars. Noah hadn't been there, but he was here now, and he felt the weight of it all. "I didn't kill him," he thought, "but I'm part of this machine that did, and she's right to hate me." He couldn't let her go without trying. That night, he drove to the address he'd found in her file, a rundown house on the edge of the city. Rain soaked his suit as he knocked, his heart pounding. Lila opened the door, her eyes red, a half-packed bag behind her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat. But he saw the flicker of something, hope or fear, he couldn't tell. "I've lived my life alone," he said, stepping closer, rain dripping from his hair. "I built this empire, these walls, and I thought that was enough. But it's not, Lila. You walked in, and I've never felt so alive, so afraid. Don't make me go back to that emptiness." His voice cracked, his hands trembling at his sides. "I didn't know your father, but I know you, and I can't lose you." Lila stared at him, her breath uneven, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "I want to hate you," she said, her voice breaking, "but I can't. I came here to tear you down, to make you pay. But you're not him. You're not them." She took a step back, her hand on the door, ready to close it. "I need time," she whispered, and then she was gone, the door shutting between them. Noah stood there, rain pouring over him, her words echoing in his head. "She can't hate me," he thought, a spark of hope flickering through the ache. "But she doesn't trust me. Yet. And maybe she never will." He walked back to his car, the necklace still in his pocket, a piece of her he couldn't let go. Inside, Lila leaned against the door, her knees weak, her heart a mess of anger and longing. "I thought I'd lost everything," she thought, tears falling, "but he's making me feel again, and it hurts more than the hate ever did." She didn't know if she could forgive, didn't know if she could stay, but his words clung to her, a lifeline she wasn't ready to grab. The breaking point had come, and neither of them would be the same. Noah Bennett drove away from Lila's house, the rain a steady roar against his windshield. Her words echoed in his mind. "I want to hate you, but I can't," a fragile thread of hope tangled with the ache in his chest. He gripped the steering wheel, the necklace still in his pocket, its weight a reminder of her. He'd laid himself bare, something he'd never done, and now he was adrift, waiting for her to decide. "I've never begged for anything," he thought, the city lights blurring past. "But I'd beg for her if she'd let me." Lila Hayes stood inside, her back against the door, her breath uneven. The room was dim, her half-packed bag a silent witness to the chaos in her heart. She slid to the floor, tears streaming down her face, his voice replaying in her head. "I've lived my life alone. Don't make me go back to that." She clutched her knees, rocking slightly. "I thought I'd lost everything," she thought. "But he's making me feel again, and it hurts more than the hate ever did." She'd come to Westwood Financial to destroy it, to find justice for her father, but Noah had turned her plan upside down. He wasn't the cold tyrant she'd imagined. He was a man who saw her, who fought for her, and that terrified her. She stood, wiping her eyes, and looked out the window. The rain was relentless, a mirror to the storm inside her. Then she saw him, still there, his car idling in the street, his figure slumped in the driver's seat. Something broke in her, a wall she'd held up too long. She grabbed her jacket and ran outside, the rain soaking her instantly. Noah looked up as she yanked open his car door, his eyes wide with shock. "Lila," he started, but she cut him off, climbing in beside him, her hands trembling. "I thought I'd never be enough," she said, her voice raw, "until you made me believe I was. I hate what happened, but I can't hate you anymore." Before he could respond, she leaned across the seat and pulled him close, her arms wrapping around his neck. Noah froze for a split second, then his hands found her waist, pulling her tighter. Their lips met, a desperate, rain-soaked kiss, tasting of salt and relief. The world outside faded, the storm nothing compared to the one they'd just survived. When they parted, breathless, Lila rested her forehead against his, her fingers tangled in his wet hair. "I thought I wasn't worth loving," she whispered, echoing her earlier pain. "But you changed that." Noah cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You're worth everything to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't know what I was missing until you." They sat there, rain drumming on the roof, the silence between them warm now, not heavy. "He didn't just see me," Lila thought, her heart steadying. "He saved me from the darkness I'd carried too long." She smiled, a small, real smile, and Noah felt it like sunlight breaking through clouds. Days later, Noah stood before the Westwood Financial Board, the report about James Hayes in his hands. "We failed him," he said, his voice firm, "and we're going to make it right." He pushed for a full investigation, a public apology, and compensation for the families affected, stepping back from some of his duties to ensure it happened. The board resisted, but he didn't care. He'd found something worth more than power. Lila stayed not as his assistant, but as his partner, her presence a quiet strength beside him. One evening they stood on his balcony, the city sprawling below, her hand in his. "You're my home now," she said, looking up at him, her eyes clear of the shadows that once haunted them. Noah squeezed her hand, a smile tugging at his lips. "And you're mine," he replied, knowing he'd never be alone again. Their love had started with a mistake, a moment of shock in the steam, but it had grown through pain and truth into something unbreakable. They'd both been lost, but together, they'd been reborn. That's the story of Noah and Lila, a love that started with a shock and grew through pain into something beautiful. It began in the heat of a moment, an accidental glimpse that neither of them could forget, and it took them through storms, both outside and within. Noah, a man who thought he'd mastered his world, found his heart in Lila's hands, and Lila, who carried the weight of loss, discovered she could let it go for a chance at something real. Their kiss in the rain wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning, a promise that love can find you even when you're not looking. What did you think? Did their story touch you the way it touched me? I mean, who hasn't felt lost, only to find someone who makes the world make sense again? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Was it the moment Noah saw her in that hot tub? Or the way Lila ran to him in the rain that got you? Maybe it's how they turned pain into something stronger. Whatever it is, let's talk about it. If this story melted your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps us keep bringing you more. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap that bell so you never miss a tale from Emma's stories. We've got so many more waiting for you. Stories of love, heartbreak, and everything in between. Thanks for being here, for feeling this with me. Noah and Lila reminded us that sometimes the best things come from the unexpected. So until next time, keep believing in love, in second chances, and in the magic of a single glance. See you soon.